Morning, everybody. Um, yeah, apologies for not making it on Tuesday for the first session. I was actually at a conference talking about environmental clerk of works and transposing environmental commitments from the impact assessment onto or into the construction phase, which was really useful. I'm not sure how everything went down with Andrew on Tuesday, but I see a lot of blank screens here. I think we're a relatively small group, and one of the positives that we've found from this process and sort of being an environmental person on a construction site can be quite isolating. So it is a good opportunity to meet and work with like-minded professionals, and being able to discuss issues and develop, at least if not friendships, sort of constructive relationships with other people within the industry. So appreciate some of you might be on site with poor bandwidth or whatever, but it would be nice to see faces, especially when you introduce everybody, because I think I'm gonna, well, I obviously don't know you, so I'm gonna take this opportunity to firstly introduce myself, and then ask for you guys to give some introductions as well. There we go. See, that's a lot easier. I did a webinar for IEMO a few years ago at the height of the pandemic, and there were 300 people on there, and I couldn't see anybody. And so it was the most unnerving thing that I think I've ever done, because you've no idea how things are going down. And so, yeah, my name is Simon Knott. I'm now an associate director at RSK, with a particular focus on the construction phase environmental services, so due diligence, which environmental clerk of works is one, as well as environmental management, and other types of service and support. We're very grateful to the University of West of Scotland, for sort of engaging with me about 4 years ago when we first started talking about developing this course, off the back of a recognition that there was a big sort of niche in the market, and a lack of, well, I would say decent training on the topic. So we worked together, obviously, in partnership, and you guys will be you'll be going through the process and the course, and you'll be speaking to a lot of the lecturers, or some of the lecturers at UWS. But we've also got guests from the planning side of things, as well as from the regulators, as well. And I don't know if you guys managed to speak, but as I say, you're speak much in the session on Tuesday, but your experiences is all really, really valuable. So if you've gone through something, then likelihood is that somebody else has gone through that as well, and so it's quite cathartic to hear that. So I'm really interested in hearing your experiences. So when we go through this, if you could pop in, and sort of give us an update. I think just the last point that I'm going to make in terms of my introduction, I am a management committee member of the Association of Environmental Clerk of Works, with a specific focus on developing and promoting the environmental clerk of works role, because there's a lot of challenges within the sector, as I'm sure you're probably aware. So looking to improve the consistency of the environmental clerk of works role to make it easier for people that are actually delivering the role. And I'm also involved with IEMA quite a lot as well. So I'm a co-chair of the environmental, or the post-consent construction phase environmental performance group, which is a mouthful. But yeah, basically, once the project's been, or once the project's achieved consent, we will then look at trying to figure out how we can improve that side of the environmental performance. So that's me. As I say, pretty keen to understand who we've got on the call. So I think, Marianne, you're first up, if you wouldn't mind just giving a brief introduction.
Yes, no problem. And yeah, thanks for the introduction, Simon. Nice to meet you. Myself, I've been working in environmental consultancy since 2009. I'm the environmental lead at K2 Management, Renewable Energy Consultancy. At the moment, I'm mostly involved in environmental and social due diligence and construction environmental management globally. Also worked on EIA, consenting, feasibility for all different energy technologies throughout my career. Just interested in getting this course really to strengthen our offering in terms of eco services.
Sure, absolutely. So that environmental due diligence stuff, is that construction phase due diligence, or is that sort of more of a corporate thing?
All different phases, really. So yeah, acquisition, vendors, lenders. So it can start in the development phase and go right through construction into ops, depending on the requirements. So yeah, it can be quite variable from high level or corporate risk management to more hands-on compliance monitoring.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much. Beata, sorry, apologies.
That was very good pronunciation, Simon. Yeah. So
good.
yeah. So my name is Beata. So I've been studying environmental engineering. Okay, back in Poland. I don't really have much experience working in a field and in the engineering or in the environmental engineering, but I hopefully will be able to maybe support my company in kind of reducing our environmental impact, because we do have lots of field staff working out in Scotland, and hopefully I can help them with that.
Who is your company? Who do you work?
I work for a company called Cyberhawk. So,
oh, okay, right.
Yeah.
See a lot of their imagery.
Oh yes, a lot. Yeah.
a lot of really nice pictures of
visual inspections and lots of pictures.
Yeah. Josh, you're up next, please.
Thanks, Simon. Good morning, everyone, again. So, my name's Josh. I have an academic background in marine and freshwater ecology. So this is a bit of a step in a different direction, I suppose. I'm currently a graduate environmental scientist at Binnies, but I've spent the last 4 or 5 months actually assisting on some ecal jobs. So really getting sort of boots on the ground, out on site, having a look, and sort of starting to build those relationships and skill sets. But this is what this course really offers me, is a new take on it and more information about how to build those skills. So all in all, I'm really looking forward to spending more time with you and sort of expanding on this.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, for those, obviously, Binnies is an RSK company, so we're in effect colleagues in a way. Yeah, and I know Emma Stevens really well.
Oh yes, okay.
So we speak fairly regularly. So that's good. No, good to have you involved, both here and in Binnies.
Well, pleasure to be here. So.
Emma.
Hiya. Yeah, my background is ecology. I've spent the last 5 years working in ecology consultancy, but the last 2 years I've spent working as a ecological ecal on large road schemes, and I've worked alongside the environmental ecal on these schemes, and I've just wanted to broaden my knowledge into the environmental side as well, really.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Kimberly?
Morning, everyone. I usually go by Kim.
Okay.
Only my grandparents call me Kimberly. I also work for Binny's in the environmental team, and I've done some work with Josh. Most of my work has been managing projects on behalf of NRW, Natural Resources Wales. I've also done a lot of work on HS2 environmental compliance. Most of that compliance work has been desk-based, so I've been looking for more opportunities to actually get out on site and apply it on site, as well as sort of as background staff.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Kim. Apologies. And Joseph. Or Joe.
Hello, good morning. Joseph will do. Yeah, so I have a background in environmental resource management. I have an honours degree in environmental resource management and a master's degree in sustainable development. The past 3 years, I've been working as I've been running my own business, gardening, landscaping services, and I have a strong background in practical conservation, working on various, practical projects across various different habitats. And I'm really interested in eco work, and I thought this is a great opportunity. So here I am.
Okay, good. No, fantastic. Thanks very much, and welcome. And thanks, everybody. So what I'll do, I'll just share my screen and hope that technology, as ever, doesn't fail us. And we all see that.
Yeah, that's perfect, Simon. Thanks.
So now we've obviously got all the introductions out of the way. I'm just going to go over the objectives of this particular session within the course. And it's, I think, even again, like we see this quite a lot. There's quite a varied background for people that come onto this course, with sort of different technical expertise and experiences. And I think maybe you will have seen this within your experiences, but there's a lot of inconsistency in the environmental clerk of works role and what it's looking to achieve. And we, as the association, and so because obviously my involvement with the association, this course is sort of uses the association's definitions, and we look at and we sort of promote the way that the association works, or looks at the environmental clerk of works, while recognizing that ultimately it's whatever's in your contract that matters. So although we can say that an environmental clerk of works is this, until we change the construction industry, which, as you can imagine, is quite a big task, we have to be sort of cognizant that different roles do exist, but we'll be looking at why or I suppose the pitfalls of that approach, or other people's approaches, and why we've taken our own approach. I'm going to very briefly explore the difference between corporate and construction phase environmental management and the documents that are involved in that. An overview of construction phase environmental documents, and then sort of looking at where the environmental clerk of works fits into the project, and what the associated constraints typically with the role, and how we mitigate those as best we can. And then we'll just look at a couple of different definitions associated with the environmental clerk of works role and the ecological clerk of works role, which obviously quite often get blended into one. So, might have given the game away there a wee bit, but the question that I would like probably everybody to answer from their experience: what is an ECAL? What, or an ecological or environmental clerk of work? What does that, when you see the acronym, what do you think? What is the role there to achieve?
Someone who ensures compliance and environmental due diligence and due process is adhered to during construction site operations and works.
Okay.
Someone who's able to highlight potential environmental or financial risks to the client during a project as well.
And potential opportunities.
Who?
I'd want to know if it's an ECOW, an NCOW, if it's the contractor, or if it's the project, because there's kind of differences and nuances between them before I could answer.
Okay, so yeah, there's an awful lot to unpick in that. So I think for you, the ECOW acronym, is it wrong or right to say that it's a bit inconsistent?
Yeah, definitely. Because if you say ECOW, some people could assume it's an ecological clerk of works and you're a specialist ecologist. Whereas if you're an environmental clerk of works, I would say it's more of a generalist looking at consent compliance and discharging EIA obligations overall. And you might need to bring in specialist ecologist advice if required. So you could get leaned on and you could get kind of pushed out of your comfort zone if people are expecting you to be a ECOW rather than NCOW potentially. And then I think the difference as well, whether you're fulfilling the role required by the consent, whereas it's more of it's more of a monitoring type role and not necessarily providing the specialist advice that you'd expect the contractor to deliver as well. So I think there's a few different roles and it's important to clarify which is which. That's just from my experience, because yeah, I see people get pulled in different directions, and ultimately it leads to failure and not being able to deliver the role as intended.
Yeah. Yes, again to all of that. Anybody else? Okay. Grand. So we've kind of looked at that again. I suppose the point of this question is really just actually to reinforce what Marianne said. It's massively variable out there as to what people expect. I think sort of we will cover this later on, but I think it's also quite important to maybe just address some of the items there that we picked up on. So Kimberly, you mentioned about ensuring compliance. This is something that we see quite a lot in terms of people's expectations as to what an ECOW can do. Now, obviously, we're probably coming at this sort of quite a risk-averse approach, and it's not going to be relevant for every project. But if your position is to ensure compliance, that really, well, contractually, unless it's written into the contract, you can't do that. You don't have the contractual authority to ensure anything. And it also puts quite a lot of liability on you as the environmental clerk of works, that you're there to ensure compliance when you have no direct contractual authority to do so. So if you, again, this is sort of worst case scenario, but if you were to see something that was non-compliant, say there was a foundation that was full of water and full of dirty water, and they were pumping that out into a watercourse, and you stop them because you're there to ensure compliance. I suppose the issue is, well, what happens if the regulator comes to the site and says, "Oh, it's okay, don't worry about it." And that is, I mean, that has happened. It becomes subjective as to what the impact was. But your act of stopping that work then delays the project, or it's it's impacted on the quality of the concrete pour in the foundation. So not only do they have to re-pour the concrete, but they have the delays associated with that. If the contractor, well, and also then it's sort of, it becomes commercial. So there will be questions as to what authority did you have under the contract to stop the works? And quite often you have none, because contractually, typically there are only 4 people through the contract that can instruct anybody to do anything. So this idea that, like, and it comes from planning, and comes from impact assessment, where people write into their commitments that the ECAL will ensure X, Y, and Z, without the impact assessment practitioner understanding that contractually there's no obligation, like they can't do that. On top of that, there's a question about, well, it brings in a bit of conflict of interest, because if you're there to ensure something, then you're also there to monitor and report on that. We feel that you're conflicted, so you're there responsible to ensure that something happens, and so whatever that looks like, and then you're also responsible for reporting on the compliance of what you've ensured. That does present a few issues. So what we are trying to work with regulators and planning consultants to sort of change the language that they use around environmental clerk of works, because I don't know, has anybody experienced anything like that, where you've been put in a situation where you've been, there's pressure, you feel that you need to stop works and you're a bit uncomfortable? I don't know, has there been anything like that for you guys?
Yeah, I've experienced that, where I've been on site and they wanted to dig up some Himalayan balsam during the summer near some water courses, and I mean, it's not ideal time, it's not an ideal habitat to be doing that, but there was no way they were going to stop it, so we just had to mitigate as best as we could to reduce the spread. And
I think that again comes down to sort of the way that contracts are structured, and the way, like, that there's not a great deal of synergy between construction, contracts, and environmental planning and law. All you can do is advise the consequences of what will happen, or what should happen, based on black and white legislation or documentation in the planning, from the planning system. So I think what we're trying to achieve as an industry, both ECAL and IEMA, is that we try and remove some of this conflict, and try and create a bit more consistency, where ultimately the people that are responsible for doing the work have environmental managers, they have environmental advisors who are there to ensure, through advice to the project manager, that the work happens, it complies with the project. From an environmental clerk of works point of view, we're looking at, it's just a pure monitoring and reporting role. So we take out that conflict where it's like, oh, we don't want to, oh, we can't report on our own advice or implementation or design because it failed, and we feel conflicted to report on that to the appropriate bodies. So we try and break that conflict of interest, but also then try and make it a bit easier. SAIM haven't helped us out in this situation because they still recognize this acronym, the Ecological Clerk of Works acronym, as being both a person that's responsible for doing work in a construction environment, but also the same acronym is responsible for monitoring compliance. So we still, SAIM is obviously a massive body compared to us, so we're kind of trying to work with them where we've got similarities because they do have an inspector role, but we do, when we are trying to push that there needs to be separation and more consistency and more clarity. So why does the role exist? And again, Marianne, you mentioned about planning conditions. But it is also riddled right the way throughout the impact assessment documentation. So in ecology, like in the ecology chapter, it'll say the ecological clerk of works will do X, Y, and Z. In the hydrology chapter, it'll talk about an environmental clerk of works doing X, Y, and Z. Quite often those don't align with roles and responsibilities, which is mega frustrating. And then, so it's in the impact assessment, but it's also typically, or it can be, and I think it's becoming more of a consent down in, or a planning condition that's used down in England, but certainly in Scotland, it's sort of a recognised condition of consent. But again, there is correlation between Nature Scott talking about the ecological clerk of works in their consultation response, whereas SEPA, who are our regulator, will talk about, or won't mention environmental clerk of works at all. And so the planning, the condition or the consenting body will talk about an ecological clerk of works, but then go, oh, well, there's the additional scope of a full environmental role. And again, we get all mixed up. So the condition of consent is obviously important because that will then sort of lead into contractual scope. So when your project kicks off, quite often the developer, I don't think we've got any developers on board, but the developers potentially are quite lazy and will just in the contract say the contractor must comply with everything that was in the impact assessment and all the conditions. And they'll pass that responsibility to the contractor. So quite a lot of there's a lot of opportunity for ecological and environmental clerk of works to be engaged by the contractor. But again, so we've gone sort of a muddled approach in the impact assessment and a muddled approach in the condition of consent. And then in the contractual scope, you also potentially got quite a muddled approach as to what environmental clerk of works is. But super important is that you're delivering a service under a contract. So whatever's in your contract, that is what you need to do. Just to sort of maintain your sort of professional indemnity insurances and stuff. Best practice. So again, we're sort of looking to promote this monitoring and reporting role where we can shine a light on what does and doesn't work, and which contractors are good and which contractors aren't, or there's room for improvement. Because at the moment, nobody knows. The whole procurement system works on prosecution, but nobody in real terms is getting prosecuted for this stuff. So what we're trying to do is create this sort of this monitoring role and this feedback loop that we can say, well, across all the environmental clerk of works reports, water management is the biggest risk, and it's managed really, really poorly, and every construction site pollutes the water environment. So what lessons can we take from that? And then we feed that back into impact assessment. So that's the idea. And so that's industry improvement and attempting to improve practice. And then rarely, but it sort of does happen. So as part of an enforcement undertaking, for those of you, I mean, so Marianne, you're Scottish based by the sounds of your accent. Not sure anybody else is. But the AWPR was a great example of this, where so that's the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route. They polluted well, 2 SACs and turned the North Sea brown with sediment. They were, it was a joint venture, and those companies that were involved, SEPA didn't prosecute them. They took them, or they achieved an enforcement undertaking. So they don't have to register that enforcement undertaking on their annual reports, and when they're tendering for work, because it's not a prosecution, it's a voluntary agreement. But as part of that voluntary agreement, a environmental clerk of works or some form of third-party monitoring can be enforced through that. So they're sort of the typical measures for why the role exists. And again, this is all super important. It's good to work back up the chain as to understand why your role is there. So your contract will say you're there to meet the conditions of the consent. In essence, you can look at your contract, but you can also look at the condition of consent, and then go back up to the impact assessment to get a good understanding of what the role is for. If the contractual scope is not very explicit. Any questions on that? So, I don't know, well, we've only just met, but I'm going to be very honest and say that I'm extremely cynical of most environmental management structures, and corporate environmental structure, probably most of all. And that's just from my own experiences. I'm sure there are some really good corporate structures out there, and some really good construction structures as well. So I suppose you will have had dealings with ISO 14001 potentially, or understand that it's a process that's supposed to drive corporate improvement. And then there's the argument that environmental managers should all have like lead auditor or be an auditor to ISO 14001. I have to say I don't really stand with that. I don't think that ISO 14001 has a place in the construction phase. I think as a corporate thing, I think obviously companies should have it, but it's not a marker as to who is good and who is bad on a construction site, because everybody has it. And it's become kind of a requirement. Well, it's a requirement of procurement. And so it's a bit of a tick box exercise. Apologies to any ISO 14001 people, and please do feel free to challenge me on that. I think it's well, yeah. I think there's a lot of learning that we can take from things. But like company environmental policies as well. So it's sort of an opportunity. So every construction company will have a company environmental policy. And usually in that environmental policy, the CEO says that they're going to do everything they can to protect the environment. If you've been on a construction site, you know that's not true. So it's about maybe an opportunity to, I mean, if things get really bad and you're not really getting anywhere with the site teams, you can just raise their company policy against them, and just an opportunity to say, well, actually, your company policy says that you're not going to have an impact, but you're polluting this water course, so you've just destroyed this badger set, or you're spreading all this Himalayan balsam all over the place. And similarly with ISO 14001, there will be commitments for improvement in that, and so it's an interesting process to understand basically how to use these things for your benefit on site. I've got annual reporting in here, and so most companies will report annually to their shareholders, and within that annual report, they'll talk about their environmental performance. And so typically at the moment, that focuses purely on carbon, and carbon emissions. Obviously, it's incredibly important. But they'll also talk about their environmental performance in terms of, have they been prosecuted? I mean, the figures actually are kind of ingrained into my brain, but I looked at the top 3 construction firms in the UK in their annual reports. So this was like a 25 billion spend, about 25 billion pound spend between the 3 of them. Anybody want to guess how many prosecutions they listed in their annual report from 25 billion pounds worth of spend?
I'd guess none whatsoever.
So the most recent set of reports that I've seen, yes, that's accurate. There are 0 reports. The previous set of reports, I think there were 5 notifications of prosecution with a total fine of £7,500, and this was again like 20 billions worth of spend. So again, maybe this is just feeding into my cynicism, but there's something wrong with the system. So I kind of ignore the corporate stuff, unless I'm trying to use it as a bit of a stick to maneuver better performance on site if that works. For me, the construction documents is where it's at, and we're just going to go on into these. So again, I feel like I'm speaking at you, so please have I assume have a shot of decoding what these acronyms are.
Construction environmental management plan.
Yeah.
A waste management plan or a pollution prevention plan?
Mm-hmm.
There's also a species protection plan on there, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the bottom one is a site waste management plan. There's a water management plan, pollution prevention plan, species protection plan, or protected species plan, outline CEMP, which isn't on here, the environmental management plan, environmental management documents. There's habitat management plan there. I think because we're environmental clerk of works and we are looking at holistic environmental risk, the amount of information that's out there is massive. Like, there's so much information, and all these documents are kind of distilled from the impact assessment. And we're expecting, well, we're expecting the contractor to have read the impact assessment through the tender process. And then we're expecting the guys on the ground to have read the CEMP at least, the species protection plans, the habitat management plans, all this stuff we're expecting. As environmental professionals, we're expecting the site operatives to have read this and understand what the risks are to the environment from their project. And I think, well, I mean, that's massively unfair, to be honest. We need to improve how we communicate these requirements and these, where the potential limitations and or some of the constraints that are involved. And that's up to us as environmental professionals. We need to take responsibility to do that. So I've mentioned outline CEMP and CEMP and all these documents. What information should be used to collate them?
The outputs of any surveys that have been done to inform the assessments, or ecology surveys, things like that.
Yep. Do you think it'd be useful that the contractor themselves fed into these documents? Is that the next question? Who should develop them?
Well, they're usually developed at some kind of EIA stage or to discharge consent conditions. So it's pre-contract execution quite often. And then you've got design changes that happen since then as well. So yeah, often in my experience, the contractor isn't involved at all. They're given these documents that can then become out of date as well.
Yeah.
In my experience when writing things like an environmental action plan, I've, during the course of writing it, reviewed the contractor's method statements to have an understanding of what the works would actually require, which helps write it. And then as works develop, we would update as the project progresses. So it's quite a useful tool in capturing updates if it's programmed in effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts?
Yes, I have a thought. I'm not just saying quietly, as a person with less experience here, I'm trying to take it all in. So yeah, would you not want the contractor or the construction contractor to have less impact in the creation of these, or at least some kind of, you know, obviously like some kind of stakeholder engagement, but would you not want it to come from mostly kind of like a third party, just for the sake of knowing that the corners haven't been cut and that all the due diligence has been done?
Yeah, totally valid point. I think there's arguments for and against a lot of this stuff. One question that I do have is who's responsible for implementing all of this stuff?
It depends what the contract says.
Yeah. But so yeah, the contractor, whomever the contract says so.
But ultimately, if I'm sorry.
No, go on, Marion.
I was going to say, if there are consent obligations, is it not the consent holder, the developer, that's ultimately liable, responsible?
Yeah. But what will the client do, the developer?
pass that on to their contractor.
So my feeling is that us as environmental professionals, unless we're directly engaged by the contractor, we're not going to be the ones that's responsible for implementing this. So I guess my feeling is that we can outline the requirements obviously in the planning system, and then into discharge of conditions. Oh, well, actually, just to support the planning application. I think the ideal situation, I think from my perspective, would be that there's a lot more early contractor engagement. So the developer or the client receives consent, and then they engage a contractor to develop these documents, because ultimately they're the ones that are responsible for delivery. If we as the client, or as we as third-party environmental professionals write these documents, and they haven't been provided to the contractor, then they're not contractual requirements, and they most likely won't have been costed for. And also, I suppose we take into account that clients love a bit of value engineering. So we as environmental professionals might say, oh, well, so-and-so, this needs to happen, and it's going to cost £500,000 for all your environmental commitments. And the contractor comes up with a better solution. Who's to say that they shouldn't be using that better solution or cheaper one? It's a commercial environment after all. So yeah, I think a big push, and hopefully as RSK will be moving towards this, so we can write an outline CEMP or an outline construction code of practice. They're starting to feed more into things, maybe even a REAC, so register environmental actions and commitments. We can provide all of those items, but ultimately the contractor is responsible for delivery, so they should be responsible for developing these out, because they're the only ones that know how the project is going to be built, especially if it's a design and build contract. So where does an environmental clerk of works fit into the project? Any thoughts on lines of communication and reporting?
I suppose depending on the scale of the project, you may speak directly to the client or through a NIAS officer, depending on obviously the scale and who you have comms with.
Can you just expand on NIAS for those that don't work in?
So my understanding is it's a role assigned specifically for the undertaking of these environmental matters. So it's a position for the client and someone who represents the client, and then they themselves can undertake those tasks just to liaise with people such as landscapes clerk of works, environmental clerk of works, ECALs, and combine that knowledge together and sort of focus it into one sole point of resourcing.
Yeah, I think NIAS is a body of the Environment Agency. It's part of their delivery framework. So for those in Scotland, the EA, and for people that aren't aware of the way that the EA work, the EA are responsible for flood defence for certain parts of like main rivers and seawalls and stuff. Whereas in Scotland, it's not SEPA's responsibility. So the EA actually have a delivery arm, which is a bit strange because they run the risk of the EA prosecuting the EA, which is probably why they engage so much due diligence and have some really good environmental structure on their projects. So yeah, lines of communication and reporting. It's really important to understand where that fits and who you're supposed to be reporting to. So again, this sort of links into what is your purpose there as an environmental clerk of works. Are you there to report on compliance monitor and then report on compliance? Who are you reporting to? You obviously contractually there'll be a requirement, but does the planning condition say that you need to report to anybody, or does the impact assessment say that you need to report to anybody? And when we're tendering for these jobs, we need to be really clear with our client. So if the condition of consent says that the environmental clerk of works is to report direct or should report to the consenting body or to the regulators, we need to make sure that the client knows that. So it's not us being difficult and saying, oh, we're going to go and tell the consenting body or the regulators. It's part of our role, and it's really important that everybody understands that, so relationships can be built. Because what you don't want, as I say, is the developer or the contractor messing up somehow, and then you having to report that, and the contractor going, oh, why are you doing that? And you need to tell us, and like obviously you need to speak to them. There's no point in sending a report off without speaking to the contractor. But that is your role, and that is your responsibility. I suppose on a large project, understand who's best to speak to, who will receive your reports in a more empathetic way. So if there's a really difficult project manager who is just purely focused on commercials, is it worth telling him that his silt ponds are failing? He's probably just going to chuck you out of his office. Whereas if you do need to tell him, so you can send the report to him and say this is failing. But if there's to be, rather than just sort of saying, oh, well, this is failing, you could say to the section engineer for that section of the project and say, well, your silt ponds are failing, you've just discharged a load of dirty water, you need to do something about it, and it's being reported. So there are ways and means of communication, and it's all part of sort of developing relationships, because you at times you will have to have really difficult conversations with both contractor and client. Marianne, you also touched on this in terms of expectations and technical disciplines, and we've got obviously specialist ecologists on the call. And historically, this is what happens, is that the ecologists are typically on site because it's generally ecology is kind of understood, like in construction process. It's like, oh, we can't, they know that they're not allowed to disturb a badger set or destroy the badger set or whatever. So ecologists are typically understood on site, but then they'll get shoehorned into all the other environmental stuff. So it'd be like, oh, well, this root protection zone, we've just tossed through it. What's the risk? And they'll ask the only environmental person that they see on site, and that's an ecologist. Now, the ecologist might have a bit of ARB understanding, but unless you feel you're fully comfortable in talking about ARB or archaeology or pollution control or waste and materials management, all of this stuff is important. I think you'll be talking about noise and sort of nuisances in the coming sort of sessions. You're typically the only environmental person on site, because until we can change the sector, the contractor's environmental manager will be there maybe once a month if you're lucky, and maybe not talking directly about Environment Agency projects. So people will come to you ask, and I guess you need to be comfortable in communicating, I'm not comfortable doing that, or I don't know, and it's perfectly acceptable to say I don't know, it's not my field. So how do we, when this environmental clerk of works role, I guess, is it one person, or is it a team of people? Is a team commercially viable? What does all that look like? I guess Emma, have you been, like, is there a team of people? I think other people have said about landscape clerk of works, and maybe get into that, but is there a team involved in your projects that you're aware of?
Regarding e-cows, or
Yeah, environmental people in general, I guess.
well, we just have the one environmental e-cow, and then there's a team of ecological e-cows, depending on what work's going on, how many of us they need. But yeah, apart from that, there's no other environmental team. Well, there's the veg clearance team when they're in, but apart from that, there's no other environmental on site.
Anybody else with any experience of teams of people or singular resource?
More familiar with seeing just a singular person rather than a team.
Yeah, I think that's probably, again, because of commercials, that's typically the approach that's taken. I personally started out, well, I did ecology at uni, and then did some waste management after uni. Went back and was an ecologist for about 3 years. And then got chucked up onto a construction project in the far north of Scotland with no clue about any of the other stuff. And this is typically what happens. So ecologists are generally the ones that get sent on site because they're more, it's people are more used to seeing them. But fortunately, I was representing the client, and I was able to learn an awful lot with very limited liability. My role there, and as an environmental clerk of works, this is really what should be happening. You can read the documentation, so all the CEMPs, it's not your responsibility to write them. You can read that CEMP and understand what it is that they're supposed to be achieving. And if they're not achieving that, then you can say, well, actually, you're failing against X, Y, and Z in the CEMP, and also legislation and planning as well. So I've been very fortunate in my first environmental clerk of works role, where there was no pressure on me, because I was just there to monitor and report, which was really useful. I've got to the point now where pretty well technically strong on quite a few things, but still not an expert in everything. So I still need to be able to go and speak to people that know more about stuff, and it's totally okay to be able to do that. You just need support from your wider team, whether that's within a consultancy or within contemporaries if you're a sole trader. Yeah, any questions on that? Okay. Yeah, as I say, we would usually have the first water management presentation after this, but I think, did you do both water management ones on Tuesday?
I think it was just the first one.
Just the first session, okay, no problem. Okay, yeah, so we'll probably get away in the next sort of 20 minutes, half an hour. So we can either stop for a break or we can just plow on to you.
Happy to keep going personally.
Consensus? Yeah, okay, nods. Okay.
More than happy.
Okay, so embedded constraints associated with the environmental clerk of works role. Kind of touched on it briefly, or maybe a bit more in depth than I maybe meant to, but these are the two main constraints that we see, which make doing the role can be very, very challenging. So scope creep. When do you think scope creep becomes a problem?
When the expectations of what your role isn't entirely accurate, and you're asked to do a bit more than what you should be doing.
Yeah, we're all environmentalists. We all want to see good environmental performance. So if we're asked a question, then we will do our best typically to answer that question or do the best for the environment. Has anybody got any examples of being put in a position where you've been asked to go beyond?
I've observed one where I would have expected the person to be in a monitoring and reporting role, but being leaned on to provide solutions and advice. And I felt that was going beyond what they should be doing in that situation.
Yeah, I think that's something that I mean, it's one of the biggest ones, to be honest. That and going beyond your technical expertise. The sort of the advice and sort of design element. So as I've said, and this is, I mean, wind farms are notoriously bad for it. Sort of major infrastructure projects are potentially less like this, but certainly keep an eye out for it. So you're engaged as environmental clerk of works. Your role is there to monitor and report on the contract or the project's performance. It's not just the contractor, but the project. As I mentioned, most contractors don't have an awful lot of environmental managers or advisors. So you'll maybe see an environmental manager maybe once a month if you're lucky, or they'll put an EHS person in, environment, health and safety person, or she or SHEC or whatever acronym you want to use. And that person is, well, the resource required for the contractor or even the client really as well. They should have their own levels of due diligence. They're not there on site every day, but because the environmental clerk of works is, they will then start leaning on the environmental clerk of works to provide design advice. So when you say this is failing, you've polluted the water and environment, or you've gone into a water vole sort of habitat, the contractor and also the developer will then start asking questions about, well, how do we fix it? But that's not your role. And if you start giving advice, I mean, and this is all, again, worst case scenario, no case law whatsoever, but stands to reason. If you start giving advice and it's not your contractual scope to do so, does your professional indemnity insurance cover you should anything go wrong? It's a question that we've asked of sort of insurance lawyers, and they've come back with, again, varied responses, but sort of typically no is the answer. The other part is obviously your technical discipline. So this is sort of in there, and also in, I'm assuming you're all members of various associations and institutions. So there'll be sort of a guide in there about professionalism. What am I looking for? What's the word?
A code of practice.
Code of practice. Thank you very much. And within that, it will say you're not supposed to talk about stuff that you're not competent to talk about. But again, because you're the only environmental person, you will be asked about it. So how do we mitigate that? What are the processes? And there's no right answer, because we're still in this still in the same problem, like same situation. So yeah, I think it just is interesting, like how would you mitigate that if you're on site and somebody asks you to design a treatment system, or at least feed into a design for a treatment system, get your opinion, ask, do you think this will work? Is that appropriate if you're just there as a monitoring and reporting resource? And how do you mitigate that?
I think typically from experience, it'd be you defer to someone that you know who's working on the project and does have those technical experiences, and then they can liaise with them at their leisure. Or similarly, you are openly and honest, because it's those relationships that really account for something with the contractor, as you say that it's not my place to comment, and I don't have that technical experience. So putting your hands up is often, I think, the best solution in that scenario, to step away from it rather than, as you say, overstepping the mark and providing advice where it's almost not solicited.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, I mean, that's the simple answer, I guess. Do we feel empowered enough on a multi-million-pound project under a lot of pressure to get work done? Do we feel empowered to, how do we empower our environmental clerk of works to be able to take that approach? I guess that's the question.
So on one of my sites, my eCal has provided information to the contractors on how to design silt mitigation. Do you think providing information like that is something that you shouldn't be doing, or?
Yes, this is where it gets hugely convoluted, because the terminology might be an environmental clerk of works in the contract and in the planning and all the rest of it. So they might be doing the role, or they might be under the role of environmental clerk of works. But if they're feeding into design, then for me, they're an environmental manager. What's the difference between an environmental manager and an environmental clerk of works if they're involved in design and implementation and ensuring? So unfortunately, without looking at the contract, I can't answer that question, but this is a bit of a crux. Like, this is the whole process that we're going through as the Association of Environmental Clerk of Works. There is no difference between an environmental clerk of works and an environmental manager if they're responsible for ensuring stuff and design and inputting into design. So why have the environmental clerk of works at all? Surely it just should be an environmental manager. So that's where we see the break.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's something he's done off his own back because they had no one else to provide that information, or something is in his contract. I'm not sure. Yeah.
And again, that's what like in theory, it's great. I mean, I know we're kind of in, and hopefully you don't see this as a formal environment, but in a, like we're in a more formal or sort of a professional environment here, and we're like, oh, we would do that, and we would definitely only do our like monitoring and reporting role. When you're in the heat of the moment on the construction site, it's maybe a bit tougher to be able to say, well, actually, that's not my thing. It's not my bag. I'm not here to do that. I'm not a drainage specialist. So yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, and that's why hopefully when we're feeding back, and all, like, so everybody that goes on this course will hopefully be going back into their consultancies or into their own practices, and feeding this back to the impact assessment people. If we can get it right in the impact assessment and define roles and responsibilities, then although it's going to be a couple of years before that comes into construction, we can start to change the narrative and try and make it easier for the people delivering this role.
When it is included in the, say, an ES, as this will be the role of the ECAL, but it's not necessarily in the contract, is it then not a case of having to comply with the ES? So it would be a role to do so. Because, for example, on HS2, obviously the work has to be compliant with the ES, and if the ES says this person's going to do this, and they don't do it, then it's not compliant, and then it can't, under the contract, it doesn't form part of the handover.
Mm-hmm.
So if it isn't compliant with the ES and the ES includes that, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, very good question. I think that's why, and not a lot of people do it when you get into construction. It's like, well, we're not looking at the ES, we're looking at the CEMP, or we're looking at registers or whatever, or the contract.
So in theory, the contract and the CEMP should all comply with the ES.
Yes, in theory, but the ES will often contradict itself as to roles and responsibilities, if they mention roles and responsibilities at all.
Okay, so in effect, we all just have to be mindful and check basically what could be written in the ES and check that it doesn't contradict itself to the point that it's going to cause us a headache.
Yeah. And then you get to have a discussion with the client as to why you need an ecological clerk of works at this rate and an environmental clerk of works at this rate, and they're two separate roles, and then it just gets fun. Yeah, I think we've kind of touched on conflict of interest as well, really. But yeah, before I launch into conflict of interest, has anybody been put in a position where they've felt conflicted? That's hugely reassuring. That's not always the case, and hopefully that does stay the same for you guys. So we've kind of spoken about roles and responsibilities and the design element of things when we have touched on this, but it is a really important point. So if your role as the association, and quite a lot, hopefully, of the local planning authorities and the energy consents unit see it as a monitoring and reporting role, if you're then also tied into design or instruction or implementation, we have had people that have actually installed silt fencing as environmental clerk of works. Then, and I suppose particularly pertinent in ecology, and this is no impact, or certainly no aspersions on all ecologists, but for some reason ecologists seem to be bulletproof, like they never make mistakes. And that's not necessarily the case. So the ecologist is there quite often to undertake mitigation, be it the protected species surveys and then the advice on that. But what happens if they don't do the appropriate surveys or they give inappropriate advice? Nobody's there checking on them to flag that up. So there is an inherent conflict of interest, and that's why the association and IEMA, we're very keen on separating these roles. So if you're in a delivery role, or if you're undertaking, giving advice, implementing mitigation, undertaking surveys, doing water quality monitoring, all of that stuff is the responsibility of the contractor or whoever's responsibility is under the contract. And the environmental clerk of works is there just purely to check that all these checks have been done. So have you taken daily water quality monitoring? Let's look at that. Look at that. Right. Okay. Well, what happened with this spike of turbidity? Have you reported that to the EA or SEPA or whoever? That's where the role is. We feel that that's unconflicted, and hopefully that's the way that it's going. But to have this blended role where you're there to advise, implement, ensure, undertake surveys, do the water quality monitoring, that's all kind of a bit conflicted. It's just a bit of a mess. So we really do need to separate out the roles, and hopefully from this course we'll talk about that a bit more, and hopefully we'll provide a bit more clarity on this. And when you go back to your consultancies or back into your systems, then we can start changing the way people are talking about environmental clerk of works, because we can, as people doing the job and writing the job specs and the roles and responsibilities, we can change the sector, which is hugely important, and try and fight some of that inconsistency that's out there. Any questions on conflict of interest or scope creep? Okay, so we're nearly there. As I've been banging on about, the environmental clerk of work, or the association defines the environmental clerk of works as an environmental or construction professional with direct responsibility for monitoring and reporting on compliance with the environmental legislation, policy, or mitigation. There's no ensuring, there's no delivering, it's just purely monitoring and reporting. So that's the association's role definition. As I'd mentioned earlier, SIEM, under their accredited ecological clerk of works scheme, as part of their role, they talk about advising on protecting valued biodiversity features, practical site-specific and proportionate assistance on how their clients can achieve compliance with environmental legislation. As ecologists, I know SIEM try and pretend that they're more than just ecologists, but let's be honest, they're definitely focused on ecology. And then manage ecological operatives engaged in ecological mitigation activities, such as undertaking ecological watching briefs and translocation of protected species. So, as I said, SIEM are not being hugely helpful with their approach, but they do have a inspector role within their accreditation system, which does meet this basically. So it's the role is that this inspector role will just monitor and report on compliance. So are there strengths and weaknesses to either of these? I've been probably not very biased. But anybody that supports, I mean, it's all about discussion. So happy to hear that.
I guess my thoughts are just, I generally agree with the association's view, and you could probably make life easy for ourselves by including that definition in any proposals or, scope of work contracts to make it clear, and then you can fall back on that as well, that you're providing the eCow services, monitoring, reporting, you know, when you are getting pushed to go beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just something to be aware of, obviously the impact assessment might not fit this definition. So as I said, the ecological chapter will talk about this. SIAM's definition, potentially, I know Jacobs and WSP do a lot of work where they talk about environmental clerk of works, but they also hybridize the role. So just when you're quoting for environmental clerk of works jobs, and I have done this before and lost the tender. I spoke to the awarding body, and I was like, what you're asking for us to do, we can't do. And they subsequently gave it to somebody else.
Sometimes for the best, though.
Something to be aware. Obviously, we're all working for commercial organizations, so we need to make money. The key thing is for those writing impact assessment that we get this right, because if it's right in impact assessment, it'll be right in the condition of consent, and if it's right in the condition of consent, then it gives us an opportunity to be consistent in our contract dealings. But yeah, I mean, if I'm certainly not going to advocate against your approach, Marianne. I'm hugely supportive of that. So yeah, just as a review then, so we've identified why the role exists. So impact assessment, planning condition, contract, good practice, enforcement, as why they can exist. And it's important to understand where your requirement came from. And also equally important to understand what it's looking to achieve. We've looked at difference between corporate and construction phase environmental management. Whereas in a corporate sense, I mean, I'm sure ISO 14000 is one, and one is fantastic for sort of existential, like carbon reduction, and hopefully we'll start seeing net gain become part of it, and efficiencies and circular economy and all that kind of stuff, which is brilliant. But how much relevance that has to a construction site is not an awful lot. So other than the overarching sort of high level information. And we looked at construction phase documents, and we've understood where the environmental clerk of works fits into the project, and the constraints associated with the role. Any comments on that before we move into the case study? No. Cool. So within Moodle, I think it's called, the platform that you've all been given access to, if there is any questions on that, on the UWS front, then please do email cpd@uws.co.uk, I think. Oh no, what would it be?
We're cpd@uws.ac.uk. I'll put it in the chat just in case.
Yeah. But also please feel free to, you can contact me directly and we can see if we can organize and sort things out. So within that, there should be a folder called case studies, and within there is background information, so impact assessment stuff, condition of consent, and so you can use that, or you can use real world examples from your own experience. The examples in the case study is a couple of years old, so more than happy for you to look at something more relevant and something you're more comfortable with. But what we're trying to ascertain is, why does the role exist? So is it in the impact assessment, or is it just in the condition of consent, or a condition of consent? Looking at your project, what documents are required, and who should develop them, where does the environmental clerk of works fit into the rest of the project, and what are the embedded risks? And I guess sort of giving this away, we're trying to look at sort of the inconsistency of what's in the impact assessment, what's in the condition, and how we would mitigate that as somebody doing the environmental clerk of works role for that project. I think Andrew hopefully has spoken to you about the sort of the homework stuff, but just to reinforce that it's not going to be subject to the highest scrutiny. We're not looking for pages and pages. I think most things are just 1 page of text. We recognize that everybody's very busy, but because we are accredited by IEMA, and also you get the credits for from the course for like the MSc stuff, we do need to provide information to those accreditors to show that you've done something and met the requirements. So please don't worry about it. But if you do have any queries or any concerns, then yeah, just let me know. And I think if you can go through this sort of fairly regularly rather than leaving it all to the last session, I think there's like a month after the course is finished for the submission deadline. I may be wrong. But yeah, what we've seen in the past is that it sort of builds up. There are quite a few of these small studies to do. Yeah, so that's this session done. Any questions or any comments?
Sorry, can you just confirm, were we answering these questions in relation to the case study we picked?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, and as I say, if you've got another case study that you're more comfortable with, then by all means, it doesn't have to be one from the selection that we've provided. Okay, in that case, have a great Thursday, and I will see you on a call in the near future.
Thank you.
Much.
Thank
Thank you
you
very
very
much,
much.
Simon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks
Have a
a lot.
great
Bye.
rest of